Hello, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you very much for being here with us today. My name is Hussain, and I'm honored to speak on behalf of my class in the Dual JD program. Today, I present one piece of a renewed royal proclamation, one that is not simply written with pen and paper, but inscribed with responsibility, reciprocity, and respect. This project is about rebuilding the broken bridges between the federal government and the First Peoples of Turtle Island. It's about moving beyond just gestures and starting a genuine legal partnership grounded in Indigenous legal orders. We know the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was flawed, not just in how it was interpreted, but in how it was abandoned. The promises were made, the words were there, but the actions wasn't. And over generations, we saw the gap between written commitment and lived reality widen. So we decided to create something new, something living, something rooted in Indigenous legal traditions and supported by Canadian law, something ceremonial but also constitutional. This wampum belt we present is at the heart of this vision. It's not just a decorative piece, it is a living legal document. Each of the 6 symbols on this belt corresponds to a section in the renewed Royal Proclamation. Today, I will be speaking to you about the 6th and final symbol, the circle, and the section it represents, commitments to denounce colonialism and reinforcing Indigenous concepts. Let me begin by explaining why this section is vital. Reconciliation cannot happen if we fail to address the core of colonialism, not just its structures, but its mindset. The systems we have inherited are not neutral. They were designed to control, to dominate, and to erase. And while many of these ideologies have been dressed in legal language or often softened in policy reforms, their root logic still persists in the way decisions are made, power is held, and laws are interpreted. We see it in the courts, we see it in the classroom, we see it in the daily lives of Indigenous peoples across this entire country. One clear and painful example is found in the story of Colton Boucher, whose death and the trial that followed revealed the deep fractures within our justice system. The acquittal of Gerald Stanley didn't just send a legal message, it sent a societal one, that the lives and voices of Indigenous peoples still exist at the margins of Canadian institutions. It was a moment that many saw as a failure of justice, but for Indigenous communities, it wasn't a surprising one. It was a continuation, a reflection of a legal system built without them and too often weaponized against them. That is why this final section of the proclamation calls on the federal government to not only acknowledge colonialism, but to actively denunciate it publicly, legally, and educationally. And beyond denunciation, it demands transformation. This section is not about replacing Canadian law. It's about completing it. Indigenous legal orders are not myths. They are not oral history trapped in the past. They are living legal systems which are applied, practiced, remembered, and renewed every day in communities across this land. These laws are grounded in relationship, not only to the land, but to the water, to ancestors, and most importantly, to future generations. And that is why we chose the circle to represent this section. The circle holds deep meaning across many Indigenous nations. It is a teaching, a law, and a worldview all at once. A circle has no beginning and no end. It represents continuity, responsibility, and return. It signifies that every action has consequence and that justice must restore, not just merely punish. The circle teaches us that time is cyclical, that law, like the moon, like the seasons, moves in cycles. Reflection, decision, and renewal are all key components of the circle. It's not about command and control. It's about accountability, memory, and restoring balance when that balance has been broken. Colonial legal traditions often view justice as linear. A wrong occurs, a law is applied, a punishment is delivered, and case closed. But indigenous legal traditions ask different questions, such as how has harm affected the web of relationships in the community? What is needed to restore trust? And what obligations do we importantly have to one another going forward? This circle symbolizes that worldview. This section of our proclamation calls for Indigenous law to be integrated, not as an add on or advisory role, but as a co equal pillar of the legal system. That means supporting Indigenous led courts. It means recognizing the jurisdiction of Indigenous nations over their own territories and legal matters. And it means reforming legal education to ensure that future lawyers, judges, policymakers understand legal reasoning not just as a niche, but as a foundation. The circle also reminds us that reconciliation is not merely a checklist, it's a lifelong process. Just as you return to the same point in a circle with each turn, reconciliation must also be revisited, re examined, and recommitted to generation after generation. So, what does this section require from Canada? Most importantly, Prime Minister, it requires courage. The courage to name colonialism, not just in abstract terms, but in the concrete ways that it still operates to this day, through laws, whether it's through funding mechanisms, or even through systemic biases we see all the time in our everyday lives. It also requires humility, recognizing that Indigenous people do not need saving or integrating, but rather they need space, power, and most importantly, partnership. We are calling for the active dismantling of colonial legal foundations. We are calling for the Canadian government to remove the remaining influences of doctrines like terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery from its legal practices, not just on paper, but in courtrooms and in policy. We are calling for Indigenous legal orders to not just be merely recognized, but most importantly, to be respected with their own procedures, their own teachings, their own rules, own laws, and their own forms of enforcement, not just legally, but socially as well. Prime Minister, we are calling for a legal system that is not just merely adversarial, where two parties happen to be in constant battle amongst one another to see who gets what, but we're advocating for a relational legal system. We're calling for a legal system that understands, rather than one that's just looking for conflict. We are calling for a justice system that does not treat Indigenous law as just mere cultural footnotes, but as a source of law which is equal to Canadian common law and civil traditions. You see, Prime Minister, the circle on the wampum belt is a vision. You know what? It's also a reminder. And most importantly, it's quite frankly a demand. It asks us to walk together, not just as a colonizer and colonize, like we mentioned with the adversarial system that's promoted, but as co-stewards of a legal future which can embrace the complexities between Indigenous legal orders and contemporary society, but one that also embraces relationships and share responsibility so that all of us could live in harmony amongst one another. Mr. Prime Minister, this section is not the end of our proclamation or any initiatives or any sort of steps to be taken towards reconciliation, but it is the beginning of a new kind of relationship. It reminds us that while the past cannot be changed, the future is still being written. We invite your government to take this section seriously, not just merely as a symbolic gesture, but as a constitutional and most importantly, a spiritual and intentful commitment to justice. Prime Minister, we ask that we let this circle remind us that mere reconciliation by words or even by actions is not linear. Prime Minister, quite frankly, it is a return and the opening of a beginning to a relationship, to responsibility, and to law that lives generation after generation. Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister.